Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Over the next half hour, we'll be looking beyond the business headlines by giving you in-depth perspective on the stories that are affecting all of us. Coming up on today's show, the global media and entertainment industry is worth an estimated $2 trillion. We'll be hearing from Nicolas Pompigné-Mognard, the founder and chairman of the leading Pan-African communications consultancy, APO Group. We'll be discussing the growth trends of the industry on the continent. Before that discussion, here's our business correspondent, Simon Pusey, who joins me for a breakdown of this week's headline-grabbing stories.
Yes, the simmering trade war between the world's two biggest economies cut US imports of Chinese goods by $35 billion in the first half of the year and pushed up prices for American consumers too. Analysis by the United Nations found Chinese firms have started to absorb costs of higher tariffs and cut the price of some exports. The group also warned the long-running dispute is hitting other countries too. The sector hit hardest by the US tariffs is US imports of Chinese office machinery and communications equipment, which fell by $15 billion. Other countries stepped up to fill most of the gap left by China, the study found, naming Taiwan as the largest beneficiary of trade diversion, with $4.2 billion in additional exports to the US in the first half of 2019. Mexico also increased exports to the US by $3.5 billion, mostly exporting electrical machinery and agriculture and transport equipment. The EU boosted deliveries by $2.7 billion, mostly via additional machinery exports. Well, earnings at Japan's SoftBank have tumbled following losses tied to investments in some of its biggest tech bets, including WeWork and Uber. The investment giant posted an operating loss of 704 billion yen, that's £5 billion, for the 3 months to September. The result was far worse than the 48 billion yen loss forecast by analysts. The firm's first quarterly loss in 14 years comes after writing down the value of high-profile tech investments. The company is led by Masayoshi Son, a Japanese entrepreneur who is known to have an eye for firms with big potential. But after revealing the loss, he said, "My judgment around WeWork was not right in many ways." He went on to say he turned a blind eye to the founder of the company, Adam Neumann's corporate governance, saying he had learned a harsh lesson from that mistake. Well, here in the UK, government spending is likely to head back towards 1970s levels over the next Parliament, whichever party wins the general election. That's according to new research. The think tank, the Resolution Foundation, said that both Labour and the Conservative parties were planning big increases in the size of the state, but it said they faced huge questions over how they would pay for it. The 1970s are often described as a period of economic turmoil for the UK, with public spending soaring during that decade. The Resolution Foundation, which aims to promote higher living standards for people on low and middle incomes, based its estimates on what the main parties have promised to date, as well as the underlying trends affecting the UK economy.
Thank you, Simon. Here are some other business news from across the globe. The Purchasing Managers' Index for global manufacturing in October stood at 48.8%, up 0.1 percentage points from the previous month. These figures indicate that global growth remains weak and downward pressure persists. The index has been running below 50% for 4 months. Experts say that the uncertainty in global trade has caused such a situation. France and China signed contracts worth around $15 billion this week during French President Emmanuel Macron's second state visit to the country. Deals were struck in the fields of aeronautics, energy and agriculture, including approval for 20 French companies to export poultry, beef and pork to China. India on Monday declined to join an Asia-Pacific trade pact that would form a major trading bloc involving the region's top economies and cover nearly a third of the world's gross domestic product. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership was an agreement between the 10-member Association of Southeast Asian Nations and 6 of its largest trading partners that was to include India and will include China. According to this year's host, Thailand, the trade pact is due to be signed next year. Nigeria has announced plans to keep its land borders closed to trade until at least January the 31st next year. The government launched a partial border closure in August to tackle smuggling of rice and other goods. As well as having a negative impact on the economy of Benin, Nigerians are also feeling the effect on their purchasing power as the price of staple foods and other items have skyrocketed. Nigeria insists the closure is curbing smuggling and tackling illicit trades between neighbouring nations. For a continental perspective on this story, joining me in the studio is Agnes Gittow, a government and corporations consultant at GBS Africa, a company that aims to foster intra-Africa and intra-Commonwealth trade. Agnes, all land borders are closed until the 31st of January, and they may even be extended beyond that day. Can you surmise what the general reaction is with Nigeria's continental neighbours?
So the reaction is this goes against the provision of Nigeria's vision, but also the wider Africa vision of economic integration. We have just recently signed the ACFTA, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. So closure of borders, and it's trade related, where we're trying to grow trade, suddenly has had, the reaction is obviously worrisome and not good.
A lot of people are saying as well it goes against the spirit of ECOWAS as well. We're talking about, you know, Africa and the free trade agreement, but then if you go much more tighter, you talk about ECOWAS, Benin. There was a stat from the Brookings Institute, and they're really following Benin Republic, and they say this is actually going to hit their GDP, that they totally rely on Nigeria, especially those smaller traders that are trading just around the border.
You see, Juliana, the irony is in 1975, over 44 years ago, Nigeria was spearheading the regional integration. So the vision of economic integration comes from Nigeria 44 years ago, you know, bringing the region together, open markets, movements of goods and services. So these closures, especially Benin, as you rightly say, 80% of Benin's import are destined for Nigeria. And it's not just the small-scale traders in Benin who are going to be affected. The small-scale traders in Nigeria who depend on that border to move from goods from Benin to Nigeria are greatly affected. And you're aware that Nigeria's economy is heavily dependent on the informal sector because obviously the government...
Exports as well.
Exactly. Despite government's initiative to promote economic growth, they really have not been able to absorb the informal sector into the formal sector. So, I mean, it's negative on both sides, both on Nigeria and Benin.
It's interesting you say it's quite negative. The border's been closed for about 12 weeks now, and Nigeria has been saying, and they're sticking with this brief, that it's important for their strategic objective. What do you think some of these strategic objectives could be? So
the strategic objectives are to grow Nigeria's economy, to promote agriculture sector, because the products that are coming from Benin are mostly rice and tomatoes and of course some packaged goods. So they want to grow the economy, they want to promote trading within Nigeria, but that really doesn't sit well with everybody else.
It was very much overnight, wasn't it? It was kind of shocking and surprising. There didn't seem to be any hints that this was going to happen.
Absolutely. And to come 3 months barely after Nigeria, remember Nigeria was the latecomer to this African movement of free trade agreement. It is quite, for me, as a champion of regional integration, as a champion of integrated market.
You actually spoke about it on channels, didn't you, in Nigeria?
Absolutely. This is where Africa should be going. The regional integration is led both by the political class, but also the business sector. So it is certainly something we need to be, but also it sends alarm bells to people like us or the wider African region who are champions of the movement, of the free trade agreement. So it's alarm bells. Say, if we can start getting this, you know, these closures this early on before ACFTA starts operation in July 2020, what do we need to do to ensure that this does not affect the whole region?
Of course, it'll be interesting to see exactly on the record what the African Union and ECOWAS will be saying about this. But rice appears to be the standout commodity. You know, there's been so many social media pictures showing it still being smuggled right at the bottom of cars and in tyres, people desperate to get it in. Rice prices now in Nigeria are, you know, record high. And it seems as if, you know, the purchasing power of Nigerians is diminishing. diminishing, really.
Absolutely. The inflation, which was very stable early in the year, is rising up to 15%, 11.1%, I think, just around over 10%, which is quite, of course, what does that mean? High prices of goods. Rice, as you say, we cannot survive without our jollof in Nigeria. So
jollof pasta.
Suddenly, and
pasta seems to be, really skyrocketing at the moment because
absolutely.
you can afford it more than you can the rice.
And you know what is happening? So Nigerians will barely afford. I spoke to a few of colleagues who work in Nigeria, Codeville Business Solutions, were saying, look, the impact is actually not on the bigger smugglers that the Nigeria government is trying to curb, but on the smaller people and the Nigeria economy as a whole. And look, there has to be coordinated efforts to ensure that customs officials and immigration officials are empowered to be able to deal with smuggling. But I think this closure, it is certainly not the way forward.
Well, they certainly don't seem to be backtracking. But we talk about the Nigerian economy. The customs boss, Hamed Ali, he told Nigerian lawmakers recently that this closure is allowing the government to rake in 5 billion naira daily. 5 billion naira. What's your response to that?
Look, I'm not sure what script he's reading from, but according to our sources, the smuggling is still taking place.
Of course.
It's a cartel that is highly networked.
Well, there's smuggling in every country
of course, and they work with these border officials and immigration officials. So what do we need to do? It's to ensure that there is coordinated efforts between Benin, not just Nigeria, Benin and Nigeria, and all the other borders to ensure that our customs are fully equipped. They have the latest technology to ensure that we're curbing this smuggling. Of course, it has an impact on Nigeria, and I can see why the government decided to do. I can sort of see, but it is quite heavy-handed.
It's the continental repercussions, isn't it? Can we talk about the legitimate business? Because it seems as if their voice has been completely marginalised because there are legitimate businesses that use those borders and they can no longer use them. They're having to go through other means and other countries, costing them millions.
Of course, and that's what. What's the impact on Nigeria's economy? Employment. These people will no longer be able to employ people. Food prices, as we talked about it. So, look, I don't think it was very well thought of. They must have their own agenda. But yes, the impact is dire, not just on the big businesses, but also everybody else in the region.
How important do you think Nigeria are to the ratification of the African Union Trade Pact? We've seen what happened with the ASEAN summit. They were hoping to have China and India on board. India stood out of it. Do you think Nigeria were too quick to maybe sign, even though they were one of the last countries to sign up to it? Are they sending a message?
I think it's a message that we need to listen to Nigerians' concern, and I think we cannot just, sometimes we move with a wave. There's a vision, the biggest market, 1.2 billion people.
We do that a lot, don't we, in Africa?
Without really looking at the underlying issues. And I completely agree. I think we move. In my view, maybe we need to go back to the drawing board, look at every country's concerns before we move ahead with this, with ACFTA, because it will be another pretty thing on paper, but not able to implement. So I think Nigeria is key to Africa's region. It's one of the biggest economy, very dependent on imports, both from Africa and without, and also exports from Africa. And I think Nigeria is saying that they only export about 4% into the African region. So I think they're looking at it, there's no benefit for them as a country, but I think you need to look at the bigger picture. If they sign up to if they fully implement and ratify the agreement, in my view, they will be able to achieve the economic vision of diversifying Nigeria's economy, growing the agriculture sector, growing light manufacturing, and I think this is the way forward.
Agnes Gitau, that's a great way to wrap it up. The way forward for Africa is Nigeria. Thank you, Agnes.
My pleasure.
Coming up, we'll be speaking about the ever-evolving African media industry. See you after the break.